Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Backlog Banter. I'm Tucker, joined by my Sonic t-shirted co-host, Abram Buhner, and today we're going to be talking about Halo 2. You might have heard of it, little game. We have reviewed its prequel, Halo Combat Evolved, one of our first reviews, and we're here to
Long
talk
time
about
ago.
that follow-up. I'll put a card in the corner if I remember it. But if you are a Halo fan, I'm warning you, I might not be on your side, but if you want to talk to me, argue with me about Halo, join our Discord. The link is in the description. You've also got a like button down there and a subscribe button. They're fun to mess around with. Like, if you give them a little click, it gives you a little serotonin boost, and I highly recommend it. But Abram Buhner, as the preeminent Halo fan of my life, and presumably the viewers of Backlog Banter's lives,
Sure.
Halo 2, give me your one sentence. No, you don't have to go that short, but give me your thesis.
I like Halo 2 a lot. I think it probably has my favorite Halo narrative in the entire franchise.
Okay.
But I think the level design is better than Combat Evolved. But I think that the campaign is pretty fundamentally flawed in certain respects.
Sure.
I think that especially like the back third has a lot of issues with its level design, even though the first two thirds are pretty good. I think there's some strange choices made that lend to it probably being the least tight of the three core Bungie games, 1, 2, 3, and probably my least favorite. That said, I still really enjoy the game.
Yeah, I mean, I was stalking your backlog account earlier today, reading
Of
your
course.
reviews of each of the games, looking at your scores, trying to get a judge on what your opinion was in the ranking and things of that nature.
Yeah.
You still have this game in a 9 out of 10, so I would believe that would be considered very good, if not close to perfect.
I would probably adjust that down a little bit,
Okay.
frankly, because I recently replayed it. I will say this is Tucker's first time playing it. I replayed it on Heroic just a couple weeks ago, which lowered my perspective on the game in certain respects.
Sure. Well, I think slightly lower is about where I come down. I think Halo 2 is a fantastic game. I think that it really sets a lot of bars that are clear where it influenced other things. A lot of my disconnect from the game comes from that my inexperience, I would say, with first-person shooter campaigns not being what I grew up with, that kind of gameplay format not being incredibly engaging to me. But on the whole, I think this game does hit a ton of incredible highs.
Yeah, it's very important. We should note that this is a game that brought Halo Online, fucking revolution. But also, I don't care. This is a campaign review. We should be very clear about that. I play
Little
Halo for the
caveat
campaign. Yes, very important to know.
I have never once played Halo 2 multiplayer, and I doubt you have either. So that will not be factoring at all into our reviews. And honestly, I mean, I'm sure I would love the multiplayer. It's just not how I interacted with the game. But to give my first thought about Halo 2 is that holy crap, I prefer the story to this over Combat Evolved. I remember in our review complaining a little bit about how it was just simplistic. It felt a little bit generic. You know, it's space, kind of just war crap, like a little too simplistic for my taste. But I think all of the things that they introduced in this game to expand the narrative made me so much more interested in what I was doing in the game. Because when I'm looking at the cutscenes and I'm understanding, okay, this is how the world is evolving and the characters are related to one another, I'm much more interested to want to engage with the gameplay to see what happens next. And I really felt in Combat Evolved, like, okay, yeah, something's going to blow up or I need to go get this thing, but the overarching narrative felt pretty barren to me. And Halo 2 completely solves that.
Yeah, I think Halo 1 is really great at environmental storytelling and really great at background lore elements.
Sure.
Its narrative is a lot more subtle and in some ways more interesting because of it, but I think that the interpersonal relationships and overall narrative and sort of religious sects and everything that kind of comes together and converges and diverges in Halo 2 is so much more interesting to follow. I love the relationship between Chief and Arbiter. I love the infighting, the Covenant, the Gravemind. The way that everything comes together is really special, and that's why I love this story so much.
Yeah, the strengths of Halo 1, I think, come from the concepts of it. I mean, the Covenant fighting the humans and the idea of these giant rings being out in space that are death weapons and they've got atmospheres on them. All that is incredible. The things on top of that being just, in my opinion, relatively generic war story with Chief, who's not a super charismatic character and whatever, but we're not here to talk about that. Halo 2 adds so much more in terms of fleshing out other aspects of the story. And I think it connects a lot better to the lore. You learn so much more about the Covenant and the Prophets and the history of the Covenant, and you've of course got the Arbiter, and then there's a history of the Arbiters and how that relates to the different species that are part of the Covenant. There's a really interesting dynamic there that personally I found a lot more compelling than anything that the humans were doing. I think Chief is fine, and I like some of the voice acting and character moments of is Miranda the Miranda and the commander guy, Sergeant Johnson. That's the most generic possible war guy name you can get. Beside the point, I enjoyed them having a few character moments, but on the whole, the religious aspects and history aspects and lore aspects of the Covenant story, I loved, and it made me a lot more interested to want to get into the lore of Halo. I mean, I honestly was hovering over a book purchase button on eBay. I was like, oh, I kind of want to check out some of the side stories. And it gets me excited to see what happens in the future and how this narrative builds. I think the Arbiter is a great character, and I personally I prefer him significantly more than Master Chief in terms of concept and personality and things like that. And just learning that the fact that we have something other than Chief to connect to, I think makes this a much more well-realized story than the first.
Yeah, it's a lot more dynamic, and I think that I like the UNSC plot a lot. What I really love about it is the way that it sort of straddles the line between the more militaristic, grounded elements and the Saturday morning cartoon hoorah G.I. Joe elements. We talked about this off camera, but Sergeant Johnson talking about how he knows how to please the ladies and fucking puffing his cigar and the big hoorahs and everything. I think there's a lot to like there. Iconic moments. Let's give the Covenant back their bomb. What if you're gonna miss? I won't. I think it's full of great moments, but I think that the Covenant storyline balances that out with a lot more serious thematic material, and it's that harmony between the campiness and the like religious fanaticism and upheaval and everything, where that sits together is where the game really succeeds, especially when you're bringing Chief and Arbiter into conversation, and you of course get more of that in 3, but I think what it sets up and pays off is really exciting.
The one thing I would say about the balance between the story is that there is a negative aspect to it, and I feel that Master Chief's story gets pretty seriously backgrounded by this game, and the amount of cutscenes that are focusing on the Prophets and learning the history of the Covenant and introducing the Arbiter and how the Arbiter interacts with the Prophets and all of that are a vast majority of the cutscenes of this game, and I think that means that Master Chief, well, you play half of the game as him, his story gets lost in the shuffle. There's not really many, if any, character moments for Chief. The story of his relationship with the other UNSC characters, nothing really happens. I mean, they go on their missions, they appear at the Halo, and can't really say much more than that. And I do think that's a little bit unfortunate. I would have, of course, preferred both stories to, come to with arcs and come to conclusions. Unfortunately, Chief gets pretty backgrounded, and I think obviously throughout the rest of this story we're going to get more of that, but just taking Halo 2 on its own, I feel it's a little bit lacking in terms of a story for Master Chief.
Well, the story of the 3 Bungie Halos is a lot like the Lord of the Rings or whatever, in the sense that this really is the middle act. And I think that in that, it does focus more on the Arbiter and setting up him and his storyline in that interplay, which is very important, especially after the first act, if you will, of Combat Evolved being Chief's narrative.
Sure, yes.
But I think the other thing is that Master Chief really helped usher in that era of the silent protagonist after the loud and bombastic Duke Nukem's and all of these guys of the 90s shooters. And Chief is a character who speaks louder with his actions opposed to his words. He's a very stoic character. And I'll be curious to see what you think as you play more Halo games, because when Chief starts to talk more in the 343 games, I think some of the allure of his character is lost a little bit.
Sure.
I think what's compelling about Chief is the way that he offers the counterpoint to the Arbiter, where the Arbiter has great moments of sort of empathy, like when he's on the ship with the Covenant captain. They're like, "Look, Arbiter, I don't give a fuck about you. These are my elites. These are my grunts. Their lives matter to me. Yours doesn't." And the Arbiter's like, that makes two of us or whatever. That's a very different texture than what Chief brings.
Yeah.
And I think the reason that this story works, maybe more than even Combat Evolved, which I think is because you get both of those. You get Chief's narrative is about taking down the Scarab tank. It's about showing up in New Mombasa and fucking people up, and arriving on High Charity and going boo, scaring the grunt, catching his needler. That's Chief, right?
Yeah, no, of course.
And I think that's more about who he is as a character than him being underwritten, in my opinion.
Sure. Yeah, actually, that's a very good point. I honestly am not a silent protagonist fan.
Yeah.
I think there's something to be said for leading a character to put your own personality onto, but for me, it just feels like it could be anyone, and why would I care that it's Master Chief? Of course, he's got the strength and he's got the guts, but I don't know if that's enough for me to connect to the protagonist as a character. But moving away from the story, just talking about the Arbiter in general, I'm very happy that you play as both of them in this game. You got, clearly inspired by Last of Us Part 2. You play as the villain in this game, and I believe the Arbiter in this game, he was the captain of the Covenant around when the events of Halo Combat Evolved took place. So I think that's a really interesting reframing the story. And playing as him, there's not a ton of tangible differences between the mechanics of Chief and Arbiter, which I don't think is a huge problem. But having the stealth, I think, makes his missions really interesting and different in a pretty unique way.
So for me, from a gameplay perspective, they're more interchangeable in my perspective. I never really engaged with the stealth elements. I think they're pretty surface level, frankly. Your active camo does not last very long, and ultimately, usually stealth in Halo is set up as a set piece, so there's like fucking 15 grunts asleep, and you can go up and melee them back to back to back to back, and it's satisfying, but ultimately it's about that sort of arena-style sandbox shooter. I think, actually, if anything, Arbiter gets lost a little bit in the last couple missions when you're fighting the Flood, and then you just get UNSC weaponry, and then you're basically playing as an interchangeable character.
Yeah, sure.
For me, it really is about what they bring from a narrative perspective that sets them apart.
Yeah, no, and I think that's totally true. And what I was saying, like, they essentially are interchangeable mechanically, gameplay-wise. They have the same speed, the same jump height. There's not any significant differences, and especially because as Chief, you get the option to use Covenant weaponry all the time. You've got your needlers and your plasma rifles and all of that just sitting around, and mixing them all together, I think, is pretty fun. I mean, having the energy sword is, of course, something that became a staple of the series, and I'll be interested to see what new weapons and stuff they add going forward, because as someone who didn't grow up playing Halo but played Reach Forge mode quite a few times, quite a bunch when I was a kid, I'm so used to all the weapons being together that having them be more prominent in 2 wasn't a huge revelation to me. And of course, that's coming from the perspective of someone not playing it when it came out in 2004. But I like that the weapons were interspersed, even if it meant that each character wasn't necessarily super unique.
Yeah, and to the point about weapons, I think this is probably the strongest arsenal in the entire franchise.
Wow, okay.
It's
a little underwhelming for future installments, but...
Well, it's not the most popular opinion, but that's the way I feel, because I think that there's a really great interplay between the different weapons here. I think that the level design is better at forcing you to fight enemies close or at a distance and giving you the weapons to have to juggle that. I think that the way that dual wielding gives you an intense advantage close, but you might be being suppressed by some jackals that are across a bridge or something, as interesting tension where you're going to fight your elites and your brutes really close, but then you're going to need to switch to a beam rifle or a Covenant carbine or something to fight long range. I think that the ways that all these different weapons feel like they serve different purposes, or at least a different series of purposes. Your SMG can kind of be interchanged for a plasma rifle up close or whatever, but I think that interplay is really interesting.
I think one of my biggest issues with Halo 2, and of course I didn't play it on a heroic difficulty, what's the even higher one, that legendary? Legendary
is fucked up.
I didn't play it on either of those, and I really have no interest to, but I think on the normal difficulty, one of my biggest complaints about the game is that a lot of the weaponry feels useless. I encountered numerous situations where I would be using some sort of weapon and I would have to unload more than a clip into one enemy to kill them. And at that point, the enemies being such bullet sponges for a large sect of the weapons makes me feel like, okay, well, I'm not going to pick that up. I see a pile of weapons on the ground. I know maybe 2 or 3 of them are going to be useful in any given scenario, and the rest of them just feel like filler. And the weapons being imbalanced made the combat feel a little bit repetitive to me. I discovered quickly, I'd say about a third of the way through the game, that if you get yourself 2 dual plasma rifles, you're pretty much set. Those fuckers take out anything. There's tons of ammo to be refilled by them. They do significantly more damage to enemies than a lot of the UNSC weapons do. They're good at long range, they're good at close range. And then you get the brute plasma rifles, which do even more damage. And at that point, I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe I'll need a sniper for a little bit of coverage. Maybe I'll need some sort of bombs or, rocket launcher or whatever. But lots of the weapons, I felt no reason to pick them up because I feel like they're honestly pretty imbalanced in that way.
So I would disagree here, and I think what I would point to, if anything, is an issue with difficulty scaling, in my opinion. Because like Halo 3 tells you outright, the way you're supposed to play is heroic. Which is not to say you played incorrectly, but to say that maybe Bungie didn't balance his difficulty quite right.
And I think that's probably my comment on as well,
because playing on heroic, you do need to use everything you have. And there's very clear instances where, oh shit, if you're being charged by a berserking brute, you're probably going to want needlers so you can needle and stick them and blow them up. But if you're fighting some jackals...
I don't think I ever killed an enemy with a needler. I honestly, maybe I don't understand how that weapon works, but it felt completely useless to me.
Yeah, and maybe I think that probably is an issue with the way that difficulty scales and the way that enemies are more forgiving and do less damage, so you can just kind of steamroll through them. But that's not going to work when you're playing here, and you need to switch between, okay, I need something plasma so I can get through the jackal's shields, and then they're far away from me, so if I can pick up a carbine, I'm going to have a bit of an advantage here. But here comes a swarm of enemies, so now I'm going to want maybe some SMGs. I'm going to want the shotgun when the brutes get up close and everything. I found myself, probably more than actually in Halo Combat Evolved, using a wider selection of weaponry, because I do think that it is important, and so I think that kind of speaks to my issue with Halo 2, being that not every challenge feels equally designed.
Sure.
And so I think it goes beyond difficulty. For instance, when you get to the last couple missions, you can just fucking walk past some enemy encounters.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull myself into that conversation right there. And I think, again, I think you're right, as we're talking mostly about how the difficulty isn't properly balanced, but I do think that as someone who played on normal, and you probably initially played on normal, so I don't know how much you remember or how much you can comment on it, but I think there are a good amount of issues with that difficulty balancing in terms of engagement with different battles. I often found, because the enemies were such bullet sponges, especially if I didn't have my classic dual plasma rifles, that I didn't find much benefit to wanting to engage in the combat in that way that you're talking about, with planning out the different routes and weapons being useful for different things, because I felt like so many of the weapons were useless, and I just wanted to see what happened next, see a new area, that I found myself more often than not strategizing to get past the enemies without engaging in the combat often. And that was really frustrating to me. I felt no tangible reason to engage with the combat if I just felt like a lot of the time my bullets weren't going to be doing anything, and in reality I should just get past the enemies, move on to supposedly a better design challenge later on, see a cutscene, and get the game over with. And a lot of the battles boiled down to me finding a way through trial and error most of the time of run past this, duck off to the side, let them forget that I'm here, jump over them, and just run to the next checkpoint so I don't have to deal with that battle.
Well, so I don't think that's the way you should be playing. What I think it's a testament to the level design in some sections not quite being up to par, that the game lets you play that way.
Sure.
It's hard to ever tell a player that they're playing the game wrong if the game lets them play that way.
Exactly. Yeah,
and so I think it falls under the fault of the level designers to where you can do that. And in my experience, the places you can do that are not the lion's share of the combat encounters. I think that Halo 2, more than Combat Evolved, does a really nice job setting up set pieces in which combat is very important. Sure. I think attacking the Scarab tank is a great example. Some of the the boats to the index are good examples. I think that a lot of the combat challenges are well designed, but when you get into some of those more open areas, I think especially when you're playing as the Arbiter, last couple of missions after the Brute Uprising, when I would hop on a Ghost and just say, okay, fuck off, I'm driving past you.
A lot of the I'd say almost all of the vehicle sections, which I thought were really fun. I enjoy all the vehicle controls in this, and I'm glad they're pretty properly interspersed throughout. You get a Banshee section, you get a Ghost section, you get a Scorpion section, you get a Warthog section. I think those are all really fun, but at a certain point I'm like, okay, well, I don't need to blow these guys up, and in reality the level is designed with the geometry for me to be able to, you know, skirt up the side and drop down behind them, and I can just fucking zoom, and they're not going to remember that I was ever even there. And I don't know if for me it feels more like the level shouldn't have been designed that way, but in my opinion, I often felt like I would rather do it that way, because I found a lot of the combat encounters to be just essentially repetitive. There was not really any tangible reward or you know, satisfaction to me wanting to kill every enemy and engage with the entire combat encounter. So I just found myself skipping a lot, and I don't want to run in circles on this point. But it meant that a lot of the game, in terms of its combat encounters, just boiled down to me wanting to get through them as fast as I could, because I didn't find any reason to really want to engage with them.
For me, I think to bring into the realm of specificity a little bit, again, it speaks to that last third for me, where that is more of an option, where I feel the campaign is dragging a little bit, so there is the incentive to just skip them. And I think part of the fun of Halo's campaigns is how sandbox focused they are, and the fact that you can kind of approach these combat encounters in different ways. So I think the fact that you can take the Ghosts and zip through them is fun. But it also simultaneously speaks to maybe some issues with the design. I think that the best Halo combat sandboxes are when you have multiple options that all feed towards the same objective, which is the combat. There's a great example, great mission in Halo 3, we're taking out another Scarab tank, and there are literally like 6 ways to approach it.
Ideas already, Bungie, SMH.
But you're fighting this tank, and there's like 6 ways you can take it out. And none of them are walk past it, right?
Of course.
And so I think that's when it's at its best. That said, I would disagree that is the majority of the game. I think that Halo 2, opposed to Halo 1, and maybe even opposed to 3 in some respects, is more linear than you would kind of expect of a more sandbox-focused game. But in that linearity, you get much tighter design. So like the new Mombasa levels, for instance, don't have as many branching paths, but they feel tighter, and they force combat encounters. It maybe force you through a choke point, but give you alternate ways to attack a situation. Like after for instance, after you get your Pelican shot down, and you're there, you fight out of that main area, your reinforcements come, and you're fighting your way through the city. There's a lot of interesting geometry with jackals sniping you and you being suppressed in the streets and trying to get in and out of buildings and everything. And I think that's when the combat's at its strongest, because it has those multiple ways to approach a situation without being so open-ended that you can just forego the challenge entirely. And I just wish that last 5 missions did a better job prioritizing that the way that I feel most of the campaign does.
Sure, yeah. If I'm going to transition this combat into something that really, you know, facilitates the combat, which I think is something that I can't complain at all about, is the world design of Halo 2. I think that there's such a fantastic variety in terms of locations that you end up going to, that it blows Halo 1 out of the water, in my opinion. A lot of my problems with that game came from the fact that, you know, 2 or 3 of the missions are the same levels reutilized, and then even outside of that, there's a lot of levels that are similarly themed. Of course, there's standout moments. You got the beach, you got the escape section at the end, you've got the pillar bottom at the beginning, but this has almost no missions that feel the exact same. Like, you're always moving to a new location with different environments, with, you know, different layers or hallways or ramps or whatever you need that spices up the ways that you're going to approach combat or traversal or whatever. And I really appreciated that. I loved so much how great the anniversary version of this game was. I think the visuals are just as good today as any modern shooter game, and I found myself often finishing a combat encounter and just looking off into the distance of what was past the bounds of my sandbox I was fighting in, because these worlds are just so fantastically designed. You get such a variety of them that I'm always interested in seeing what was next. And especially, I think my favorite location in this game, just from a conceptual and visual standpoint, not necessarily the level that you're actually fighting in, which is High Charity, the big city at the end, which you stand on the edge of whatever the fuck it is you're fighting. I have no idea. And looking off into the distance and just seeing you're in this giant dome and there's a city that's like sprawling outwards and it's all covered in this giant thing. And I was blown away by that. And it really helped tie it into the lore and get me more interested in the worlds. Okay, I love the Halo, but there's so many more interesting locations outside of that as well.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think there's something to be said for how contained Combat Evolved feels, and I like that. But I also love fighting in the urban New Mombasa, and then going to High Charity or fighting the Covenant City, and then you get some of the more natural areas too. But there's such a great mix of these, and I love when they start to come together a little bit, like when the Flood are here and everybody's fighting everywhere, and you're jumping between locales. It's really great, and things come together. I love the missions where the Flood are fighting the Brutes, and you're down on the ground in the kind of snowy area and going through the wrecks and the crashes and everything. There's a lot of great dynamic ideas here, which I really appreciate.
I think inside of those creative, incredible worlds that I love with the great variety, I think this game's honestly its biggest flaw, and I know I kind of said that for the weapon balancing, but I think its greatest flaw is a lot of the levels that you're actually traversing within those worlds do feel pretty repetitive, and I think it boils down to one specific thing that is totally a relic of past gen level design, is floating platforms and elevators. Because this game has a huge issue with putting you on something that's moving slowly and reaching to another area. You've got tubes you slide down, you've got elevators you ride up, you've got platforms or gondolas that are riding across the water, you've got one that goes underneath the water. Almost every level has some version. Actually, I think that's an exaggeration, but a lot of the levels, to enough where I felt it was getting repetitive, have a section where you're just sitting on a thing and waiting for it to get location. And that was very, very frustrating to me.
Yeah, that's definitely a holdover of that era of design of trying to load things and keep the gameplay feeling seamless.
Yeah.
And because of that, I didn't really notice. I mean, they are plentiful, but I don't think that they're overbearing in my perspective. What I think would have fixed the problem is that basically every kind of arc of the game's narrative, whether it's going after the Heretic as Arbiter or going after the Prophet as Chief, probably could have one less set piece than it does.
Sure.
And so I think if you spent just a little bit less time in each kind of chapter of the narrative, these things wouldn't feel as long. But sometimes it does feel like, yeah, maybe we could spend a little bit less time in this building. Maybe we could spend a little bit less time in this area. And this is a longer Halo campaign than most other Halo campaigns. It's 15 missions. They're usually closer to 10.
Oh, okay.
And I think that is...
Isn't Halo 1 the longest campaign, though, even though it's 10 missions? I believe I was looking up the HLTB hours for each of the campaigns earlier with Abby, and I think he told me that CE is the longest in terms of time commitment.
Yeah, I honestly don't know, but I think that the fact that you're moving through areas a little bit quicker makes it not feel quite as long.
Sure.
And of course, I was playing on Heroic, so I'd get my teeth kicked in sometimes and be playing the same sequences over and over again. But I think that kind of exemplified the fact that maybe you could have truncated some of these individual sections.
Sure, yeah. In all honesty, outside of that, I don't have a ton of complaints with this game.
Yeah.
My complaints about the weapon balancing or not being engaged by each combat encounter, I think boils down to what I was saying at the beginning, is I don't find straight up first-person shooter campaigns to be particularly interesting. For me, I want something a little bit more. I want an upgrade system. I want some side quests. I want some ways to engage with my character on a little bit larger level. So just having the gratification of blowing up an enemy while there's no issues at all with the gunplay in this game. The controls feel great. I love you got your classic Halo floaty jump. You've got your shields. All of that is fantastic. On a subjective level, lacking those external rewards or upgrades or a little bit deeper in terms of the gameplay mechanics, it didn't connect with me. But outside of that, I have a lot of things that I can praise this game on. And while I'm not a Halo fan because of this game, I totally recognize why so many people love it so much and consider it one of the pinnacles of the genre and then of the series. The music is fantastic. I think this game has a much stronger, diverse soundtrack than the first one. I think the soundtrack in the first one is fantastic, but I remember a lot of times in this game specifically where the music would kick in and be like, oh, this is awesome, but it's also very different from what was playing earlier, and I really enjoyed that variety.
Yeah, I mean, the music is great, and to your point, this is what I like.
Mm-hmm.
I think Halo does a nice job not being over encumbered with stuff it doesn't need.
Mm-hmm.
It really is a pure gameplay experience. It's about the narrative and it's about the gunplay, and it's about the way that those two play off of each other and build upon one success.
Yeah.
So I think that does a great job feeding between them. I don't think that you play a gameplay section, you see a cutscene, you play a gameplay section, and it kind of feels isolated. To me, it doesn't. I think that the ways that the narrative has a direct impact on gameplay, the way that the brutes revolt, now you're fighting the brutes, or you're playing as the arbiter, and you've got grunts alongside you when you've spent so long being conditioned to the narrative that you got to fight them. I think that there's a really great symbiosis there, and for me, I think when Halo stays simple but gives you complexity through its strategy, that's when it's at its best. And I think that's why I am a little bit less of a fan of 2 compared to the others, because I don't feel like the design is as tight to facilitate that.
Sure.
When you're playing Combat Evolved or you're playing 3 and the game it's still side quests, no upgrade systems and stuff you're talking about, but a lot more intricately designed challenges. Mm-hmm. That's a lot more gameplay to engage with there.
Sure.
So
and I'm excited to see how it evolves with 3, especially considering that's another game console generation for them to work with years more of game design experience to flatten out the repetitiveness of what I was saying with the levels and the elevators and all that. And of course, better hardware for them to work with. I'm excited to get to 3, especially considering that you and what you're saying, a lot of people consider that to be the best of the series. Yeah. One thing that I will say, though, while it is lacking in some of the things that I like to engage with certain games, there is one thing that I think this game adds that really does feed in something that I enjoy, is rewarding exploration through lore terminals. One is hidden within each level, and I found almost all of them, and I loved that. I think stepping into a corridor where you're like, oh shit, I just need to find some cover, and realizing, oh, there's a terminal here that's going to show me a cutscene, which they're not as animated as the other ones, but I think it's fine. A cutscene that's going to explain to me some more history of something or feed into the larger narrative. I really enjoyed that, and it also made me want to engage with the levels in a more specific way rather than just blasting past them. I love that they had that, and it made the levels a lot more engaging to me than anything did in Halo 1. Even just that simple thing.
Yeah.
Did you
anything else you want to
care too much about the lore terminals? No. I'm just curious. No.
That's not the way I play games. I think that the momentum and pacing of Halo is part of why I enjoy that gameplay loop so much. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to intentionally break it. I'm just not one that plays for that sort of information. I am much more interested in getting that information outside of the game, through watching lore YouTube videos or whatever, when I'm engaging it with it in that context. That's just the way I play. Yeah,
and that's totally a subjective thing, but I think having them in the levels at all,
definitely,
for me communicates that Bungie is looking to flesh out the worlds a little more, give the players a little more incentive to want to engage with the levels, and I'm very glad that they were there.
I will say those are also in Combat Evolved.
The lore terminals?
Yes.
Oh shit, I don't even remember that at all.
I will say
maybe I found 1 or 2 in Combat Evolved. Okay.
You gave me a crisis of confidence, but I'm 97% sure.
You could be right. You could be right. I don't remember them, but regardless, I love that they're here and and even if it is true in Combat Evolved, the fact that I found a lot more of them and actually noticed them as a significant portion of why I enjoyed this game means that they're probably better placed in this game or something. I don't know. And also maybe it's because I was more interested in the lore of this game and the narrative that was being told that I wanted to seek those out, and whenever it was, I was very interested in what they were telling me. And it was all extra information that I thought it excited me to get to the next cutscene and say, oh, okay, so now I know this history of why this faction is fighting this faction, whatever. I thought they were a great addition.
I like when games excite you.
Yes, that Sure, yeah, that's about the bare minimum, but I think that's a great point. Yeah, great point. Sure, sure.
Great point. Sure. Anything else you want to add?
I really don't think so. I think Halo 2 coming down on it for me is not a game I will probably ever replay. I think it fixes some of my issues of one, but continues some of the trends of others. But I'm just interested. It interests me enough in the lore of the series and the evolution of the gameplay to want to try the next few games. And whether or not I connect more to the 343 games than the Bungie games, or it excites me more to have games built on stronger hardware, I'm still moving forward, and I predict myself being more interested by the series. I think these first two are a great base point, but for me, it's what got me springboarded into being interested in the rest of the series.
Yeah, I think that I won't go as far as to say that the 343 games build on what Bungie did, but I definitely think that there is a pretty big jump in quality when you get off of original Xbox onto 360 and see what they did with 3 and did with Reach. To that point, though, I definitely want to hammer home how much Bungie learned between Combat Evolved and 2. I think that the game is so much bigger in scope, and of course we were playing the Anniversary Edition, and I'm not one of these fucking fools who'd rather play with the original graphics. I think that the Anniversary Edition looks great, especially the fucking cutscenes.
Yeah, oh my god, they're great. But I didn't even mention that earlier, and I think I kind of just went without saying, but when I boot that up, I'm like, oh my god.
Yeah.
They redid all the cutscenes in like fantastic motion capture and perfectly matching the voice acting and fantastic animation and cinematography. And I actually was watching a few Halo 2 videos and saw some of the original cutscenes, and I'm like, wow, these still look really good for
it's still really impressive,
or for original Xbox hardware. But these match current games that are coming out, and the Anniversary Edition came out a while ago, so the fact that it still holds up well today is fantastic.
Yeah, it came out with the launch of the MCC. That was the big push from a single player perspective to get that game. So 2015, I believe that was.
Sure.
But or 20, no, I think it was 2014 for the 10-year anniversary. I think that makes sense. But I could be wrong about that. I didn't have an Xbox at the time. But no, like I said, I think that Bungie really learned a lot from Combat Evolved, and this feels like a much grander, much bigger experience. I just think that a notoriously rushed development cycle led to the game not having the precision that I think makes 1 and 3 and Reach so special.
Sure. Is that it? We're done here? Halo 2
I think that's it.
Finally?
Yeah.
And I'm going to be playing the other games inevitably. My excitement of them has increased, and also my access to get Xbox Game Pass has increased exponentially from 3 weeks ago. From none to some access to Xbox Game Pass.
Yeah.
So those other reviews of those other games may be coming more imminently than the gap between our Halo 1 and 2 reviews may make you think.
And Halo 3 is a shorter game, and I think you're gonna like it more. I think you really could blast through Halo 3 in 2 sittings. Not to tempt you or anything, but you could definitely do that.
All right. Well, thank you very much for watching, everyone. If you're a Halo fan, I hope I didn't, upset you too much. I hope I explained my perspective on my negatives pretty well. But thank you for watching. Talk to us about Halo in our Discord. Abram is always jonesing to do that. And
always, sure.
We'll see you guys in future Halo videos.
Goodbye.
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 You did.
I did the banjo. I did the banjo noise. The banjo noise.